Many people might be surprised to learn this National Historic Landmark in Roxbury is one of Boston's oldest surviving examples of luxury waterfront housing. Dating from 1747, the Shirley-Eustis House was built by a colonial governor, William Shirley. But the house has meaning beyond property value and status symbol. It's a reflection of place in the world and sense of mission, something to be decoded with the help of historical maps from the Leventhal Map and Education Center at the Boston Public Library. These elements can be explored April 17th in a virtual tour. To tell us about it are the executive director of the Shirley-Eustis House Association, Suzy Buchanan, and the center's curator of maps and director of geographic scholarship, Garrett Dash Nelson. Thank you both very much for being with us.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
I want to start with you, Suzy, because a lot of people might say, Governor Shirley, I mean, what's the big deal about him? We had other colonial governors, but why him, and why this big building he wanted to build?
Well, Shirley was a sort of a unique creature in New England because he was really a dyed-in-the-wool Englishman. He was born and raised in England. He came from a family that had sort of nobility and position, but they were sort of less wealthy than others, and he had lost his fortune as a young man. But throughout his life, his ambitions to be, and to embody that ideal of the English gentleman stayed with him. And when he was finally able to get enough money from his victory at Louisburg, he sort of parlayed this military victory on behalf of the British Empire into a financial reward. The first thing he does is take that money and build himself a gentleman's estate out in Roxbury, joining a whole lot of other elites who were in Roxbury at the time. These were these summer estates where they spent the summer in order to be away from the disease and stench of Boston, because of course in the summertime the Boston Harbor would fill up with sewage and become a not very nice place. So, and I think the thing what's remarkable about the architecture of Shirley Place is that instead of building a vernacular sort of version of Georgian architecture here, like his other sort of elite, peers did, he actually uses, he builds a Palladian mansion in a high academic architectural style, which was being practiced in England at the time. So he's really distinguishing himself as sort of an avatar and a representative of his English identity, his representation for the English crown, and the English nation, the British Empire. It's all writ sort of small in this mansion that he built in Roxbury.
Right. I'm turning to Garrett. These days, if you go to this house, which is on Shirley Street in Roxbury, all you see is a residential neighborhood, and there's a sloping down to a more, industrial commercial area. So it doesn't look like a great location. But rewind to the middle of the 18th century. What did it look like in your maps?
Yeah, Boston's a city that has gone through extraordinary physical and social change over the past few centuries. Places that we now think of as neighborhoods, like Roxbury and Dorchester, were, of course, their own independent towns for many, many years before they were annexed to Boston. Dorchester, in fact, was a larger and more populated city than what we now think of as downtown Boston. Roxbury was a sort of the country on the fringes of the city. It was separated from Boston by tidewater. There was a very narrow Boston Neck led into Roxbury. And so for colonial settlement in the 18th century, the distinction between these places was much, much more sharply marked than it is today. You didn't have this continuous urban fabric stretching from downtown all the way out to, say, Route 128 or beyond. Instead, you had these much smaller kind of nucleated settlements. You also had a geography that was still very much shaped by American Indians and the presence of native peoples. So the maps that we have in the collection are invitations not just to think about where things were in the past, but also how people experienced those spaces in the past. Governor Shirley, of course, would have seen a place like Roxbury as a kind of rural retreat, something that perhaps we don't think about it in association with Roxbury today, but was absolutely the case at the time.
Coming back to Suzy, speaking of maps and boundaries, that whole effort to lay siege to Louisbourg up in Cape Breton in what's now Nova Scotia, that was about fishing rights. The French wanted their territory, the English colonists wanted theirs. They all wanted to make money. Isn't this really about expansion of empires?
Absolutely, yes. And at the time, Louisbourg, we don't really think about it today. Sort of sitting here in Boston, we kind of think of it as a backwater, but it was a very large and important commercial port for the French at the time. And Shirley's desire to attack was because he witnessed sort of a buildup of French forces up there. And so he knew something was up. Meanwhile, back in Britain, the British are fighting their wars with France kind of on the home front, and the North Atlantic colonies are, sort of a couple tiers down in the level of importance for territoriality in those days.
Coming back to Garrett here, because you look at the maps, you see these different place names. What I noticed, so skimming through them, is that you see names that look familiar today because they were put there by English colonists. But then you see things pinpointing the presence of Native Americans, and it almost seems as if people said that's the immutable way things are, and as we later found out, they weren't so immutable.
Yeah, it's interesting. I always remind people, historical maps weren't made so that we in 2021 could figure out, oh, where was this or where was that? These were documents that had a really important purpose at the time. Many maps were created by the British Empire to govern territory that, again, was, days, a week's sail away from England. They were also created in order to lay a kind of moral and conceptual claim on land that was inhabited by other people. So the erasure of American Indians from colonial era maps was not just coincidental. It wasn't just that, the English had forgotten about these people and places, but that they were trying to make a case that this was English territory, that it was part of the British Empire. And the maps were doing that kind of work for the people who made them.
Kind of, Suzy, about William Shirley, because sometimes people today, they engage in revisionism. They say, well, he was an American before his time. Other people might say, no, he was one of these rapacious British imperialists. But is there really this sort of antithesis between American independence and British colonial expansion? I mean, didn't one really help enable the other?
So let me see if I understand your question.
Because this is about you have this colonial expansion, the colonies coming together in the French Indian War, expanding the empire, and at the same time, that was turned against the empire in the Revolutionary War.
Yes, that's exactly it. And then I think in some ways you can boil the American Revolution down to the sort of American mercantile class basically wanting to pursue empire on their own terms. The task was still the same. It was sort of conquering land and people in order to control trade and natural resources and to increase your wealth. The Americans just didn't want to be controlled by the British anymore as they did it. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, no, that helps. It's exactly it.
Yes.
Karen, I want to ask you about another quality of maps here and place names, because just recently, we have seen Dudley Square become Nubian Square. It's not the first time a place name has changed in Boston, but how does that make you look back at the different places and the changing names that you see on your maps?
Well, people name places according both to the customs of their time as well as to the people and events and locations that they consider to be important. And there's good reason for us to reconsider those as time goes by. The ways that we imprint names both into the landscape itself and then encode those into maps is a process of exerting cultural power. And so, as we see something like Dudley Square get renamed in recent years, that's part of a continuous process of negotiation of what should we call places. places don't have a natural name to themselves. It's tempting to think like, we just live in this place called Boston, right? But of course, that name itself comes from English colonialism. It comes from people who brought cultural patterns from east of England to North America. And again, when you see the names on the map, it's not just a reminder that these were tagged with this name, but a sense of laying claim on land and a sense of saying, this is our place, this is what we're going to call it.
Suzy, occupants of houses also changed. If you were to walk around the Shirley-Eustis House right now, what would you see and how would it tell that story?
So if you walk around the Shirley-Eustis House now, it really is Governor Shirley, if he were to sort of, descend from the heavens or rise up, wherever he is, and look at the house today, he would recognize it, but he would say, my, how it's changed. But a couple things that he would recognize, which made the house distinctly Palladian and distinctly sort of grand and academic, were these full height monumental pilasters across the facade of the building that really give it sort of a very formal aspect. And then in a sort of a central entry, there was this rusticated entrance, the rustication being these, they look like blocks of stone around the door, but in fact they're wood. And then when the house is sort of purchased and remodeled after the Revolutionary War, the subsequent owners kind of federalize it. They remove a lot of that kind of heavy Georgian sculptural qualities of it and replace it with a lot more lighter, flatter, delicate federal pieces. And that's the house that if William Eustis came back today and saw the house, he would recognize it as his own house very quickly. It hasn't changed much from his time.
You also have some nice grounds there, and I understand maybe it was Governor Eustis with his medical background, but somebody at some point or other might have been growing cannabis. Is that true?
Oh, I haven't heard that story. But hemp was commonly grown, right, in those days, and so I was reading about this recently, and I only touched on it, so I'm not sure, but there just wasn't a sort of a Puritan tradition of smoking, and it was purely a utilitarian weed for fabric and rope. It's hard to imagine that their Native American sort of neighbors might have been using it, and that the intermingling of cultures wouldn't have introduced that, but you really don't see a lot of records for it. And so I actually just don't know. I haven't done enough research on my own about that question.
Good. Finally, Garrett, for people who haven't checked out these maps before, one thing I found was that I approached them with a certain lack of enthusiasm, but once I took a glance, I was hooked. Well, what's it like?
Yeah, maps from the 18th century to maps that were produced 18 minutes ago are rich, complicated documents. We tend to take maps for granted because we use them in such prosaic ways, like finding the nearest Dunkin' Donuts. The physical collections of the Map Center represent some of the most important documents in the history of the city of Boston, but they also require a kind of careful interpretation to understand what we're seeing, how space is represented, who made these documents and why, and how they invite us into broader questions about the geography of the past.
Finally, Suzy, for people who want to take part in the virtual event on the 17th or find out more about the Shirley-Eustis House, is there some way they can follow up on that?
Yeah, they can, they can get on our website. There's a link to the event there at www.shirley-eustishouse.org. They can give me a call at the office. Our phone number's on the web, or they can email me, or they can just look up on Eventbrite, the events listing, and they'll see it there. Tickets are selling fast. So one thing that as I've sort of gotten to know the Shirley-Eustis House in the last year, one of the things that was so inspiring in terms of getting the idea to contact Garrett is spending time in the cupola of the Shirley-Eustis House and understanding the geography of the house, from that position on high, and looking at a really wonderful illustration from the 1770s that shows the house sort of in its context, and the fact that Shirley, when he was in that house, had a view out several miles into the ocean, and when he went up into his cupola, you know, with his spyglass, which of course every gentleman had, he would have been able to see so much of the world and understood what was going on in the harbor. And so just in terms of understanding that house and interpreting it, geography plays a huge role. And of course, in order to explore that geography, you have to look at those period maps. And so that's why it seemed to us like this collaboration with Garrett would be just tremendously fruitful.
We'd like to thank you both very much for being with us. Garrett Dash Nelson from the Leventhal Map and Education Center, and Suzy Buchanan from the Shirley-Eustis House Association.